War, every time it has been discussed for the last several thousand years, we've had to try to talk about it in a moral frame of reference. When is it right to go to war? When is it not right to go to war? What is right to do in war and what is not acceptable whatsoever? When we talk about the philosophy, when we talk about the rightness and wrongness of things, there has been this necessity to create some sort of theological or philosophical framework. And for the past several thousand years, this theory of what is proper in warfare has been developed. Now, we're going to be diving in a little bit of theology here, but we're also going to be delving into what the UN uses. The United Nations uses this. Nations in modern day context is always going to be appealing to these principles, and they're basically generally accepted across the board. So when we get into a conflict with right now what's happening in Israel and Hamas, when we see what's happening in Eastern Europe, when we see other wars that are kind of popping up, this is going to be something that's going to be discussed. Now, we're going to be going through a bit of a slideshow here, and we're going to be just going a little more in-depth than what we normally do on this channel. It's just going to be a bit heavy kind of stuff. You're going to want to kind of pay attention. You're going to want to be able to see the screen on this one because we got a lot to cover. We're going to be covering all of this a little more in depth, and I can't take credit for the slideshow. Maddie Morin actually put this presentation together, but it's going to be a very helpful thing for you to kind of see visually what is being discussed at the UN, what is being discussed by nations when they start talking about why you can't target civilians and different aspects of warfare, why they're moral or not moral, and who's the aggressor. Why are they even discussing all these things? This is why. Just war theory is designed at its root to give qualifications whether or not it's okay to fight a given war, right? Before, during, and after. And so there are three principles here of just war theory. The first principle is jus ad bellum. Okay. It's got Latin in it, so therefore it's got to be really brainy. And basically, before you go into a war, is it justifiable to go to war? Pretty basic question, right? But really big in its impact. Jus in bello. What is ethical behavior in warfare? Big conversations happening all the time today, right? Jus post bellum is kind of more of a new conversation that's been taking place in the last 100 years or so. But what's a legitimate just peace treaty? All right, so let's start off with the first one. When is it right to go to war? Now, you can be applying this to your personal life. When is conflict okay? And then also, you can apply this to nations. This is now mostly designed and to explain how nations interact with each other. You got these principles: just cause, right intention, legitimate authority, last resort, probability of success, and proportionality. Now, you need kind of have all these in order to have a legitimate war, a just cause. You need to, have some kind of rightness to your cause. If you're just doing evil, well, then you shouldn't do that, right? But it's always going to look different for different folks, right? But if you can just look at it and just say, this is just evil and wrong, you should stop doing it. If you can't come up with some legitimate way to describe what you're doing in a moral term, you really need to stop doing that. Now, if you're talking about from a biblical perspective, I'm a pastor, so I'm going to be looking at this a little bit like that. But, does it agree with the Bible? Like, does the Bible say you shouldn't be doing that? If so, then you shouldn't do that. Right. So in addition to that, what about nation states? Can they do certain things? Is it theft to go and take land that's not yours? So you need to have a just cause, but that's that's why they start talking about our cause is just. That's what they're appealing to. And then the right intention. Um, you know, just because you think it's good for the United States to have all this land, and that's you can't just pick a fight with Mexico in order to take all their land. And that's exactly what the United States did. But that's why you can start looking at that and going, was that a just war? The Mexican American War kind of feels like it wasn't a just war. And we can look at that and at least have a framework where we're at least explaining, we're at least thinking through the morality of conflicts, right? Legitimate authority. Now, this basically means that your government actually gives, that you have a government. You're not just like a terrorist organization. A terrorist organization that doesn't have any government or any desire to govern. If you're a revolution, but you're not actually trying to take over the country, that's if you're just trying to do revenge, that's not legitimate authority. That's why you see revolutions very quickly trying to set up an actual government and say, we're the legitimate government of this country. And they're appealing to this principle of just war. And you see this constantly. That's why they're doing it. Last resort. You should be able to try to talk your way out of things first. If you can come to some sort of resolution, war should be the last option. If it's your first option, it's an unjust war. You need to exhaust all of your other options before you go into war, right? Last resort. There should be some probability of success. This is an interesting one. That if you can't win, if there's no way that you can win, maybe you're not even trying to win. You're just trying to make yourself feel better or your group feel better. You're just trying to punish another country. That's not probability of success. And so that's where you can start seeing an organization looking more like a terrorist organization than a nation that is waging war, a just war. So there should be some probability of success. And when there is no longer probability of success, you should surrender. Japan didn't really get that, right? Japan was not going to surrender. And it has been argued that that was unjust. In fact, there's criticism of Germany, Nazi Germany, for not surrendering earlier because when it became clear that there was no probability of success. And proportionality. So basically, like if someone does something to you or some country does something to your country, and then you're like, we're going to wipe out your entire country now. That's not proportionality, right? You need to, they're stealing some of your goods from, in your trade, like as your shipments are going through their country, they're stealing some of your stuff. So you're going to wipe out their whole country. That's not proportional. And this term is being used right now in the international community. Norway and some other country, I forget which one, is now criticizing Israel for lack of proportionality in their response to the Hamas attack. So this is absolutely being discussed right now, whether people or countries should go to war is definitely a topic of conversation happening right now. And then we'll also have this conversation. When you're in war, you need to discriminate, not discriminate against someone's skin color or something like that. Discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. You need to be trying to, this is where the whole concept of civilians comes from. When we go back in history to where this came from, which we'll get into shortly, this long ago, they started to really see people that are fighting are different than people who aren't fighting. You can attack the people who are fighting, but you can't just go around just killing whoever you want. That's not right. You need to discriminate between aggressors and non-aggressors. Proportionality. And as I say, this word keeps getting repeated now. But if they're fighting against you in a certain way, and then you just go all overboard against them, that's not right either. If they are just trying to deal with your armies and they're not attacking your civilians, and then you suddenly start attacking their civilians, that's not right. If they're agreeing to use safe weapons that will not endanger civilians, and then you go in there and you're starting to use weapons that indiscriminately target people, that's not proportional. This is where the idea of conventional arms versus weapons of mass destruction, they see this proportionality is different based on different kinds of weapons. Not only that, but there is an idea that, if someone is using force to kind of threaten your country, but like they're not really threatening the eradication of your country, and then you just go in and just steamroll them and take over their entire country, and there can be a lack of proportionality there too. But of course, this is one of these conversations that's a little hard to have, right? When a country gets into war, they just kind of throw off a lot of restraint, but it's a conversation that needs to be had. Responsibility. So if you are in war, you're going to be held accountable for what you do. So a soldier who has a gun is going to be held accountable for what they do with that gun. And that there is a law to war. And there needs to be not just like, I was told to do it, so I did it. No, you're responsible for what you do. Just because you're in the military doesn't absolve you of all guilt. So that is the theory of what happens in war. Now let's look at peace time. Okay, now this is, like it says, newer categories. Again, discrimination. So like after World War II, who are we going to punish? Are we going to punish everybody from those countries? Or are we going to punish those who committed certain crimes? To what extent are we going to punish certain crimes? If everyone was kind of helping with the war, so does that mean everybody goes to jail for like forever? Or do we have to kind of have some kind of way to kind of figure out who's the really bad people? Proportionality again is what they did in the war versus what kind of punishment. If they leveled all your cities like in World War II, the UK was devastated, right? And because of the awfulness of World War II, because of the awfulness of World War I, the proportionality was considered to be, make it really hefty. Make it really, really, in World War I, they laid a super heavy burden on Germany, right? So that it would never happen again, which kind of actually backfired and created. So this is kind of out of the failure of World War I, the rehabilitation. This is when we started the idea of, well, maybe just kicking them when they're down is probably not the best idea because it just doesn't work. I know it makes us feel good, but it doesn't work. We need to rehabilitate the country. We need to get the country to be a part of society again. And so that means we need to give them a path forward, right? And so even the victor needs to kind of help, attempting to help rebuild so that the war doesn't just repeat. And so that's kind of like after the war. So let's talk real fast about kind of the history of it. It kind of began with Christians, and that as we look at the bigger picture here, is often credited to Saint Augustine, as he attempted to kind of create a theology of war. When can Christian countries go to war, and why, and how should they conduct themselves in war? And as it says, he pulled from Roman and Greek thought on this, so that he could kind of, even Aristotle, some of the conversations there, kind of pulling them in. But Augustine, and then later Thomas Aquinas, drew heavily upon St. Augustine's conversations and such. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas is the one who really kind of started adding names to everything, and creating the principles and such that have been in discussion since the 13th century. So in the 1200s. It really did come about due to the Christians, and that's why I say it's got some theology in it. And there's even though it began in Christendom, it has in the 20th century really kind of came into global thinking. So the United Nations was kind of founded based on some of this. And definitely there have been some big challenges to things like weapons of mass destruction have been definitely a new thing. Modern terrorism has definitely tested the limits of just war, and starting things like the war on terror and that kind of thing. While a lot of you may never have even heard of just war theory, in governmental circles and military circles, this is like mandatory reading. Like, everyone needs to know this. Military personnel, whether you know the name of this, you at least understand the principles because you've been taught it. You've been taught these principles because they're extremely important. And so for civilians who are concerned about where things are headed, you need to start educating yourself about these principles and thinking through what is proportionate. Why do we have to keep civilians safe? Because if you don't, you start falling into some of these thought processes. The consequentialist, the idea that, as it says here, the concept of military necessity. So that's a conversation that's being had over in the Middle East right now. Well, you're not supposed to attack civilians, but the bad guys are hiding under buildings packed with civilians. So what do? That's kind of complicated, right? And that's when they start talking about, well, military necessity, as if there are military targets and they're using human shields, then they're a legitimate target. That's a conversation about this. And then on the other side of things, the intrinsicus, whatever, basically says, and you see this conversation being had out there, because our cause is just, anything we do is okay. And that Hamas is definitely taking care. Hamas is taking that position right there. Because we're right, we can do anything we want. And you see, Israel is taking this position where they're trying to parse through the complicatedness of all this, right? But both these ethical positions break down when confronted with actual war. The just war theory attempts to maintain moral guidelines to either prevent or to govern war. Attempts is in an important word there, right? And when you start looking at pacifism of like, well, then all war must be bad and should just don't do it, versus realists, which is like war exists and we must deal with the fact that it exists. For a pacifist, war is always wrong, and a realist, war is necessary, right? So how do you work your way through these things? So if you can't have a truly properly run war, because there's always going to be civilian casualties, because is any cause truly just enough to counteract the suffering that's going to be caused, right? And if you're like, well, no, war is never justified. Pacifism, right? Or realism is like, well, you need to protect yourself because no one else is going to protect you. When it comes to a country, if you don't protect yourself, no one else is going to protect you. That's just the realism, right? So you see kind of different ways you can kind of go into this, and you see where a lot of these conversations are being had. It's complicated, and war is nasty and messy, and you may have a certain morality going into a conflict that you don't necessarily adhere to when you become desperate. And you see this, war crimes happen. Even though countries may be trying to be on the up and up, some of their soldiers go off base. They go and do horrific things, right? Mistakes sometimes are made. And so we have the Christian worldview that comes to play here. We have the morality of whatever the UN is, and kind of the world, like, do good stuff, which doesn't really have any teeth to it. Where does the teeth come from that? I don't even know, right? But so in the end, just war theory gives us guidelines, a framework to at least discuss these issues. Most people generally agree on most of these principles. But then when we start getting into the nitty gritty, what do these principles mean? What is a just cause? What is proportional? What is true discrimination between civilians and combatants? Like, how far do you go on that? Where's the right point on that sliding scale? Right? Do you just call off the war because a civilian might get harmed? Or do you just go all out and, you don't really care what happens? It's a sliding scale. How much concern should be given? And so, and in the current framework with nuclear war, we have a very real possibility of destroying much of the world. We could destroy a large portion of the humanity with a war. So does that mean that there are no just causes now for a world war? That's a conversation that's been starting to have since the atomic weapons, right? So down in the comments down below, if you could just kind of let us know what you guys are thinking. Do you agree with the tenets of the theory? I mean, maybe you don't agree with them. Is there a just cause for war? And, should you only do that in resistance of aggression? Is there such a thing as defining, or is it just kind of like just free for all? Do whatever you want as long as you don't get caught. What do you guys think on that? What about preemptive strikes to prevent more casualties? If resistance to, should it be considered resistance to aggression if they're going to attack you and you can kind of get ahead of it? Or should you only respond to actual aggression? That's pretty relevant, isn't it? And when you talk about terrorism, when you have non-state actors, that are engaging in warfare, how does that change when you have people in conflict that aren't even countries? When you have ISIS and you have Al Qaeda and you have Hamas, how do you deal with these? Lots of big questions out there, and I will leave that in your plate to think about. Maybe rewatch through that again. Maybe read through these slides. Just grab your, maybe just go back through this video with the sound off and read through all the slides, because I wasn't reading most of them, right? I was giving you kind of my color on those kind of things. So you'll get more even if you just go back and read through all these, or even delve a little more deeply into the history of things. There's so much more on this presentation, and there's so much more in this conversation. Books and books and books have been written about this topic, and it's been debated and discussed ad nauseum at the UN and by the United States in the lead up to wars. Sometimes these things are discussed. Sometimes they're just swept under the rug and they just go right on in. A lot to discuss about it. All right, friends, thanks so much for watching. If you want to check out another video from this channel, there's one right up here. I'll see you over there, or I'll see you guys later. Steve Poplar of the Poplar Report, out.